This video is sponsored by Everwinter, a holistic gaming convention that features tournaments for multiple games, including a full-sized Warhammer 40k major held the weekend of December 8th through 10th. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we just witnessed the climactic finals of the first World Championships of Warhammer, the first event of its kind, and was an incredible showcase of the game and the competitive spirit and the competitive community. The event this year was won by Manny Chima, who took Chaos Space Marines to an almost undefeated record. And today we're going to be covering the event in question, the format that this list played through, the list in particular, its strengths and weaknesses, as well as all of the matchups that Manny played. We're going to be talking about 10 rounds of Warhammer 40k, which is everything he played over the course of the weekend, an absolutely insane breadth of 40k. So grab a drink, settle in, don't forget to hit like and subscribe on the video if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, and let's dive in. First off, a little bit of background about the event itself. The World Championships of Warhammer set out to crown both world champions for each participant game, but also an aggregated national score for each participating country, based on both hard and soft scores, things like painting. To begin the 40k event, players were separated into groups of 24 for the group stage. 8 groups in total were put together, and the top player from each group after 5 rounds was put into a championship bracket, which is a double elimination tournament. So the players would need to lose twice to be out of the running once they got out of their group stage. This meant that players that went 5-0 in their group stage were automatically going to be put into the championship bracket, but there is a possibility that you could go 4-1 or 4-0-1 with a loss or a draw on your record, and good tiebreakers, assuming that none of the other players went undefeated, could allow you to make it into the championship bracket on that record. The event had a lot of stream coverage available for it. The Warhammer Twitch channel was covering it all weekend, both the 40k and Age of Sigmar events, and we also saw some non-English language streams from French Wargame and Le Voix de Horus. I'll drop links in the video description to all of the channels that covered the event. The coverage was absolutely incredible. I want to throw a special shout out to French Wargame. They were absolutely professional and had insane setups all weekend, and we're going to be taking a lot of footage from their coverage.
As the year grows colder and there's not but the icy nip of Jack Frost outdoors, what's better than to curl up with a hot mug of cocoa next to the roar of indoor central heating and one of the largest miniature gaming events of the year? Everwinter is one of the many amazing events presented by Wicked Dicey. Veterans of this channel might recognize some of Wicked Dicey's past events like Everwinter 2022 and Ironweld, which both supported the channel and I covered on stream. They were amazing events, and Wicked Dicey always puts on an amazing show, but this year they are coming back bigger and better than ever. Everwinter is a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza now at a new location in Waltham, Massachusetts. This gaming convention features competitive play for a frankly dizzying number of miniature games, including a full-size Age of Sigmar GT, a Star Wars Legion Championship, and events for other games such as Malifaux, Infinity, X-Wing, Armada, Conquest, Song of Ice and Fire, Middle-earth strategy battle game, and many more, including, let's be honest, the one that you're probably the most interested in, a full-scale Warhammer 40k major. Last year, Everwinter brought together close to 100 40k players for their major, and this year promises to be even bigger. If competition isn't quite your style, there is also a variety of casual and narrative events to choose from, as well as a variety of board games and hobby workshops so you can hone those paintbrush skills. I couldn't be more excited for Everwinter 2023, and I will be there all weekend. So please come and join me December 8th through 10th at the Westham Waltham, Boston, and head on over to wickeddicey.com/Everwinter for more information and to get your tickets today. I'll see you on the battlefield, gamers.
Now let's move on to the winning list. This was obviously piloted by Manny Chima from Glasshammer Gaming. Now the list that he brought was a pretty unique flavor of Chaos Space Marines. If you've been watching my videos covering recent Warhammer 40k tournament wins, you're going to be seeing a lot of Chaos Space Marines in the last couple of weeks. They've really, post data slate and post nerfs to especially some factions that really controlled melee armies, things like Adeptus Custodes, they've really come into their own as a competitive faction. We usually see them bring a bit of a mid-range style where they they focus on both melee and ranged attacks, but Manny's list has focused almost entirely on ranged attacks with more of a horde focus. This list was led by 3 undivided Chaos Lords, 2 undivided Dark Communes, as well as a single Nurgle Dark Commune. These then led 2 units of undivided Accursed Cultists, as well as 1 unit of 16 Accursed Cultists. We also had 3 units of undivided Chosen for the Chaos Lords to join into, and that was all supported by 3 Nurgle Chaos Rhinos that the Chosen, as well as 3 units of Slaaneshi Chaos Legionaries could embark into, backed up by a Forge Fiend with ectoplasmic cannons and a single Nurgling unit. Now let's discuss for a moment exactly why Chaos Space Marines are good and why this variety of Chaos Space Marines is so successful. The real power of the Chaos Space Marine Index currently is its incredible stratagems. They're able to make their units difficult to deal with by making them untargetable, giving them stealth, or an Armor of Contempt style of effect, making their already difficult to kill units even tankier. On top of that, they're also able to give them a relatively long threat range, with a lot of units in the army able to advance and charge innately, and the Slaaneshi stratagem giving Slaaneshi units the ability to advance and charge as well. This means that most of the army has an incredibly long threat range, is relatively resilient, and, especially with Profane Zeal on the undivided units, has an immense damage output in melee. Looking at the highlight units in particular, this list is focused on 3 units of Accursed Cultists. These things are incredibly difficult to take down, with a 5+ invulnerable save given by the Dark Commune, plus the built-in 6+ Feel No Pain that the unit has already. The Accursed units have the equivalent of somewhere around 36 wounds. You have to deal 36 damage to get through their 5+ invulnerable save and 6+ Feel No Pain in order to kill the Accursed Cultist unit itself, and that's not even killing the Demagogue in the Dark Commune unit. However, it should be noted that the Dark Commune unit has several non-character attachments inside it as well, meaning that it's basically applying 4 additional wounds onto the unit as a whole that you can assign saving throws to. On top of that, they also regen 6 wounds per battle round, getting either 3 of the 1-wound mutants or 1 3-wound torment back in both your command phase and your opponent's command phase, meaning that if you don't kill them in one go, they're just going to start to regenerate and very quickly be back up to full strength. They have a once per game ability to buff their combat stats and get advance and charge, high base OC, and good damage potential, especially with Profane Zeal on the undivided cultists. Really, this unit does everything. They give you an immense amount of board control with lots of fast infantry. They're incredibly tanky and can do incredible damage, especially when buffed up by stratagems. The single Nurgle unit also gives Manny an outlet for Dark Obscuration, meaning that Manny can play it more aggressively out in the open and not really be threatened to lose it even against high volume attacks, because on the turn that it's most important, it simply can't be attacked. Following that up, we have those 3 Chosen units. Those are good armor crackers and problem solvers. Similarly to the Accursed Cultists, they have an innate advance and charge, lots of high value attacks, and with the attached Chaos Lords, get free strat duplication once per battle round. You can commit 2 of them in, use Profane Zeal with the CP on one of them, and then duplicate the Profane Zeal with the other unit. You can do that either between the 2 Chaos Lord units, or you can do it between the undivided Accursed Cultist units, giving both of those units full rerolls, which then stacks very nicely alongside the Chaos Space Marines Dark Pact to get lethal hits or sustained hits depending on what they're hitting. The Lords themselves are also incredible combat monsters. They contribute a ton of high damage hammer attacks with the ability to, once per game, increase almost all of their combat stats by 1. Alongside all those full rerolls and the Dark Pact effects that they're already unlocking, these guys themselves can blow up tanks. Once you add in all of the other attacks from the remainder of the Chosen, this unit is an absolute nightmare. These 3 units of Chosen are going to be jumping into Nurgle Chaos Rhinos. Again, that Mark of Nurgle gives them access to Dark Obscuration, which means that in some circumstances, the Nurgle Rhinos cannot be targeted by enemy attacks. Dedicated transports are already a difficult unit for a lot of factions to deal with, so having a dedicated transport that has long threat range units embarked within it and situationally can't be targeted by attacks makes it an absolute nightmare to deal with. Oftentimes, in order to deal with units inside transports, armies rely on shooting them to open them up and expose the units contained inside, then using melee to try to kill those units. But if that Nurgle Rhino can stay farther back because the units inside already have a relatively long threat range and potentially can't even be targeted by ranged attacks, only being targeted by melee, it's going to make it even more difficult to take those out and actually access the units being contained inside. Now, on top of that, we also have those 3 Slaanesh Legionaries, and this is a little bit of spice that Manny Chima has added to his own list build, which I absolutely love. The Slaanesh Legionaries, like I mentioned before, have access to advance and charge from this Slaanesh stratagem. And they give this Chaos Space Marine list something that very few other Chaos Space Marine archetypes have access to, and that is cheap and disposable trading units. Obviously, a lot of the units that we've been talking about so far, these undivided chosen bricks and these big accursed cultist units, are relatively pricey and kind of high value. You don't want to be throwing them away to attack anything, but these little tiny legionary units are extremely cheap and extremely effective. If targeting an enemy on an objective, they get full wound rerolls, meaning that especially alongside Dark Pacts, to shore up their hit roll, they can be converting almost all of their attacks into most infantry, and again with that advance and charge, they have a relatively long threat range. This means that these Chaos Rhinos can embark a single unit of Chosen plus a unit of Legionaries, use the Legionaries to screen for the Chosen or to disrupt enemy objectives, kill enemy chaff that would normally be blocking off the Chosen from getting to their intended target, and those Rhinos can just sit there and basically act as carriers where they disgorge these incredibly fast, incredibly potent combat units into your enemy deployment zone from somewhere on the midline of the table, while being relatively difficult to deal with in that position. Multiple times over the course of the event, we saw Manny use these Slaaneshi Legionnaires to movement block enemies and to deal with smaller enemy utility units where he didn't have to necessarily be committing a huge Chosen unit with a Chaos Lord attached when he didn't need to. A lot of times in Chaos Space Marine lists, this kind of role would be fulfilled by ranged attacks, but Manny's focus on melee means that not only does he get to threat saturate his opponent with multiple charging units that can all advance and charge and are all relatively dangerous alongside the cultists, the Chosen, and the Legionaries, but he also isn't really affected by line of sight blocking terrain. Whoever said melee was dead in 10th edition, I don't think really anticipated this style of Chaos Space Marine list coming to the fore with a very limited number of ranged attacks, but massive focus on fast melee units. Now that said, this list isn't entirely bereft of ranged attacks. We do have that single Forge Fiend in the back, and that is mostly going to be used as a problem solver. Most of the time that thing enters strategic reserve, pops off whenever it needs to kill something along the sides of the table, uses Profane Zeal in the shooting phase to get full hit and wound rerolls with its devastating wound guns, and then is mostly able to shoot its points value back every time it activates in the shooting phase. It isn't Nurgle, so it is susceptible to return fire, but with some smart rapid ingresses or good use of strategic reserves, you can put it into a position where it's difficult for your opponent to deal with it, at least before it gets its value. Having at least one ranged attack in your army is always good because your opponent has to constantly be worried about that, and especially an undivided Forge Fiend is one of the most potent ranged attackers in the game right now. So your opponent always has to consider where it could potentially go and its potential targets anytime they're moving, and that can force them to move up and screen aggressively or hide themselves in their corner and allow you to gain board control or give you juicy targets for your Legionaries to charge to pick up units for free. Now before we move on, we can talk about some potential counterplay to armies like this. While Chaos Space Marines are certainly coming out as one of, if not the most powerful army in Warhammer 40k, they're certainly not unbeatable. Being a melee-focused army, some things that this army doesn't really want to see is jamming infantry. Things like cheap screens or cheap fast units, you can potentially be preventing a lot of its movement and limiting its threat ranges into your juicier units. You also need high-value attacks to deal with those accursed cultist units. They're extremely difficult to kill, but they aren't impossible to kill, so if you have units that are capable of converting 36 or more wounds into an accursed cultist unit, those are also very valuable. Outside of the accursed cultist units, the army itself is not particularly difficult to kill. The Chosen units are 3 wounds apiece, but they are only a regular Space Marine stat line, so once they're committed to the table, they do go down relatively quickly. So as long as you can deal with those accursed cultist units and you have some backline units that are capable of dealing with the Marines once they're on the table, it is possible to defeat this army in a straight up fight. That said, it's extremely efficient and it's very difficult, so it is going to be a tough battle either way. And in the hands of a good player like Manny Chima, it is extremely difficult to do. So with that, let's talk about exactly what Manny's opponents tried to do against him, and we'll dive into Manny's games. Now, starting with the group stage, as I said before, this was a 5-round event. The players would play out all 5 rounds, and then the top 1 player, based on either wins or tiebreakers, would then progress to the elimination stage. In round 1, Manny was up against Alex Matheson's Custodes. Custodes are in a little bit of a tough spot this game, and while they do have a lot of defense against melee armies, with the use of Unwavering Sentinels to fight first on objectives, making them able to take charges and then swing back anyway, they unfortunately do fall prey to the board control and damage values that the Chaos Space Marine army has. While Alex's list did have a pair of Caladius Grav tanks, which could potentially answer the Forge Fiend, if Manny was able to get his Forge Fiend into position before those things could take care of it, he could potentially be knocking out whole Custodes units with its devastating guns before they got to the fight. On top of that, he just has insane board control, and the large number of Alaris Terminators in Alex's list means that he's very focused on deep strike and reposition effects, and having mass numbers of accursed cultists that, while the Alaris Custodians can potentially deal with them because they are a high volume unit and get lots of rerolls, especially against character-led units, which all of the Accursed Cultists are. They're going to do so when not in a prime position. And if they're not able to get to objectives, they're then not able to use that Unwavering Sentinels, and so they can potentially just be picked up by the Chaos Space Marine Counterpunch. Manny was able to absolutely just dominate that matchup, winning 95-15. That moves us on to round 2, where Manny was up against Jaden Iwasa's Chaos Knights. Jaden's list was a traditional War Dog focused list, but did have a single Knight Rampager with an Aura of Terror. The Knight Rampager is good when dealing with single hard targets, but unfortunately Manny's army doesn't necessarily have any of those. And again, almost everything in his army is extremely good at cracking armor, meaning that these War Dogs are going to be dropping pretty quickly and don't necessarily have the volume required to be able to knock out the Accursed Cultist bricks. Well, they do have mass numbers of blast weapons with Havoc multi-launchers and Avenger chain cannons. If Manny's able to manipulate the target priority so not all of them can target a single unit, at least with their direct fire weapons, he can make it so that they can't necessarily kill the Accursed Cultists in one go, allow the Accursed Cultists to regenerate, and then push up and steal the Chaos Knight's objectives. Following up with the Chosen and the other dangerous units that can then deal with the Rampager and the remaining War Dogs. With that, Manny was able to take this one down 85-31, pushing him on to round 3 against Andrew Gagno's Tau Empire. Now, Tau Empire are one of the factions in the game that can deal with the Cursed Cultist bricks. Mass Cyclic Ion Blasters from their Crisis Battlesuits can put out enough damage, and especially when overcharging to go to 2 damage, they basically sort of ignore the Feel No Pain that the Accursed Cultists have some of the time, because it being only a 6-up Feel No Pain, you'd have to roll double 6s to save a model against a 2 damage attack, meaning that it's highly unlikely you get any successful Feel No Pain saves on your 1 wound models. It helps the 2-3 wound models a little bit more, but 2 converted Psychic Ion Blaster shots do still kill them. So it is possible for Tau to one-shot the Accursed bricks, but Tau being an army that functions almost entirely in the shooting phase means they have extra trouble with transports. They have to kill the transport, they don't necessarily have good melee attacks to follow up and kill the units inside the transport, and especially with Dark Obscuration, meaning that those transports have to be interacted with at a very close range, otherwise they're just going to be untargetable and you're not going to do anything to them. Tau are going to have to get uncomfortably close to the Chaos Space Marine army to actually try to deal with them, and it takes several turns for them to kill a transport and everything inside it. On top of that, Tau are susceptible to getting pushed out by a primary jam. If the Accursed Cultists just push across the table, force the Tau to deal with them, but with the long threat range of the Chaos Space Marine units, prevent the Tau units from being able to push up and actually contest the Chaos Space Marines on primary, it's very easy for Tau to lose very quickly on primary, and I have a sneaking suspicion that is what happened. This was a relatively low-scoring win for Manny, but still a pretty big one, 75-44 in favor of the Chaos Space Marines, and that put Manny on to round 4, where he played against Brian Dougherty's World Eaters. Now, both Manny's round 4 and round 5 were played against World Eaters, so I'll touch on both of them here. World Eaters are great at armor cracking, and while they are a one-phase style army, they focus more on the fight phase, almost entirely on the fight phase, I should say, rather than Tau, which are focused almost entirely on the shooting phase. And to be fair, the fight phase is better at dealing with those rhinos and transports than shooting is, because you are able to surround the transport, force an emergency disembarkation, or even, if you get lucky, prevent units from disembarking at all, meaning that everything inside the transport is killed in response to that transport being destroyed. And World Eaters are good at killing rhinos. They're extremely strong at armor cracking, but I have a sneaking suspicion they do get bogged down by the Accursed Cultists, especially with the Chaos Space Marines and World Eaters having relatively similar threat ranges. So the World Eaters in this case don't necessarily get to use their threat range increasing Blessings of Khorne to bully their opponent, and with Manny able to throw immense numbers of resilient bodies in their way to slow them down, and then counterpunch with extremely efficient melee units that can clear out the World Eaters' melee aggressors, I can definitely see this going in Manny's way. In round 4, he did beat Brian Dougherty's World Eaters with a relatively convincing 98-53 score. He had a much closer game in round 5, however, against Anthony Vanella's World Eaters. We did talk about Anthony Vanella recently, who did take down the Cali Cup kind of out of nowhere running World Eaters. He did still win that one, however, 93-81. That, at a 5-0 record, put Manny at number 1 in his group stage pod, which then allowed him to progress to the elimination stage. From here, the number of games that Manny would have to play had not yet been determined. Because it being a double elimination event, if he lost a single game, he would then move on into the losers bracket and have the opportunity to redeem himself and get back into the finals by winning all of his subsequent games. So this moved us on to round 6. This was against Ludovic Stamler's Eldari and was streamed on the French Wargame Twitch channel. Now, Ludovic was playing a relatively standard variety of vehicle-focused Eldari. It was focused on an Avatar of Cain as well as a small unit of 5 Wraithguard and an MSU grip of highly effective light vehicles, things like Night Spinners and Hornets. The downside of these styles of Eldari lists is that while they're incredibly good at scoring and incredibly good at dealing with armor, they have a lot of good technical profiles. These are profiles that can stack together relatively well, especially alongside things like Fate Dice, Fate, and Unparalleled Foresight to deal incredible damage, especially against high-value targets. The downside is that Eldari do have an occasional trouble with volume. Without running mass things like Shadow Specters or Warp Spiders, they aren't necessarily able to deal with a high model count enemy. And this was the weakness that we saw come to the fore in this game, where Manny was basically able to swarm across the board and large bricks of Chaos Space Marine infantry, jumping out of their rhinos, moving up aggressively, and absolutely dominating board control. Ludovic was largely pushed into his deployment zone, really unable to deal with the very fast threat range that the Chaos Space Marines were able to bring, and that gave Manny the win 92-43. That moved us on to round 7, where he was up against John Lennon's Ultramarines. Now, this game was absolutely fascinating and the subject of no small amount of drama online. I have an entire video talking about exactly what happened in this game. It was originally a win to John Lennon, 70-68, but that win was eventually reversed thanks to a misplay by John that was picked up after the fact. It was simply an obscure rule that was forgotten, and I have an entire video just about that. I'll link that one here and in the video description if you want to go check that one out. That said, Manny will play several games against John later on in the event, and we will discuss this matchup at length there. That moves us on to round 8. This ended up being the semifinals of the event and was against Lachlan Riggs' Chaos Space Marines. Now, as far as I can find, there is no stream for this game, unfortunately. It being a mirror match means that there is a lot of variables that go into the final winner. The comparative skill level of the players, and as well as things like simply who goes first and what mission parameters are drawn for that round, can have huge impact in a mirror match. Now, if I had to guess, Lachlan's list is much more shooting-oriented than Manny's. A lot of the shooting from Chaos Space Marines can get blanked by Dark Obscuration. Obviously, you don't want to get too close to other Chaos Space Marine armies because shooting at their Rhinos or their Cursed Cultists just puts you in threat range of their other, more dangerous units. If Manny is then able to limit the number of attackers able to target his Accursed Cultist units, I can also see that Lachlan's list would have a potential trouble dealing with the Accursed Cultist horde. With Manny's ability to control the board with his mass numbers of Accursed Cultists, Lachlan's only has 1 unit, but Manny, obviously with 3, means that even if Lachlan's able to kill most of Manny's Accursed Cultists, he's most likely going to have the objective advantage, which it seems like was able to contribute him the win 84-74. And that moves us on to round 9. Now, this was ostensibly the finals of the event versus John Lennon's Ultramarines. Now, as we talked about before, John had originally had a win reversed, meaning that he's coming in with a loss on his record and coming from the loser's bracket. Manny, however, as we've seen, has not lost a single game so far. So, if Manny is able to win this game, he is the undisputed winner of the World Championships of Warhammer. However, if John is able to come back and win this one, they will both have a single loss on their record. But the event being double elimination means that another round must be played in order to determine the final winner. One of these players has to have 2 losses on their record in order for the other to win the event. So let's discuss this matchup in detail. John was running a Vanguard Spearhead that was extremely technical and relied a lot on repositional effects and mobility. These can be prevented by Manny's access to extreme board control. Manny has tons of large volume units that he can string across the table to prevent good deep strikes and attacks onto his objectives. Also having those Rhinos, which are largely unshootable by the heavy ranged attacks from the Space Marine army, as well as being able to disembark their occupants, use the embarked units as movement blockers or deep strike screeners themselves, and then also have the Rhino as a separate unit, which can go cover a separate area of the table, gives Manny's list the ability to hold objectives all over the table, as well as screen out very effectively. Now, on top of that, Manny's extreme threat range with mass numbers of high movement, advancing, and charging enemies means that one of the Vanguard Spearhead's biggest enhancements, it's blade driven deep on its Apothecary Biologus, allowing Marnius Calgar and his Aggressor Brick to deploy forward, can't really be used very effectively. It potentially gives Manny the ability to get turn 1 charges on that unit and potentially pick up a very expensive, very valuable unit early on in the game. Ultimately, I do think that this matchup 9 times out of 10 will come out in Chaos Space Marine's favor, just simply because of the amount of board control and threat range control that they exhibit. However, the benefit of the Ultramarines list, and the reason that John is playing it, is that it is so mobility intensive that it can pull itself out of a lot of bad situations. As we saw in his previous game against Manny, he was able to squeak out a potentially very, very minor win before the result was finally reversed. Now, in this round 9 game, Manny started out super strong with lots of board control. He was able to dominate 3 of the 5 objectives on the board, and John was forced to play relatively defensively to avoid Manny's threat ranges. However, towards the late game, John was able to sandpaper down enough of Manny's forces that he felt comfortable pushing forward. He was able to push his aggressors and company heroes into the center of the table, and then roll that into a string of absolutely huge charges, including 1 boxcars to get into grips with a Chaos Rhino on a turn that he had drawn Bring It Down from his tactical objective deck in order to kill that Rhino, flip an objective, and flip the final score in his favor.
The charge, they know what it is.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Oh
my god!
That is A12.
Everybody, the rest of the room just saw it. The rest of the room just saw it and they pop it off.
This string of events actually brought the game to an 80-80 draw, but the event rules stipulated that if a draw within the elimination stage was reached, the game would actually play a 6th battle round, during which only primary objectives would be scored. In this case, John was able to push so aggressively, he had dominating control of most of the objectives on the table, and the players agreed that Manny would not be able to come back and beat his primary objective score, meaning that John took the win. This meant that the event progressed 1 additional round. Both players now had a single loss on their record, meaning that the round 10 was all to play for. An absolutely staggeringly exciting finish to the World Championships of Warhammer. Moving on to round 10, this one was played on Hidden Supplies. Hidden Supplies spawns an additional objective in the center of the table. It removes the center objective, splits it into 2, and then positions those 2 objectives away from each other. However, adding additional objectives to the board played into Manny's game plan of dominating primary objective scoring with his massive amounts of board control. With this in mind, Manny actually switched to taking fixed objectives, relying on cleanse and deploy teleport homers to be able to rack up massive amounts of very safe secondary objective points while remaining far outside of John's threat ranges. Able to put a lot of his units in relatively safe positions with a safe place to score deploy teleport homers with a centrally located vehicle, as well as having access to lots of no man's land objectives thanks to that Hidden Supplies to score cleanse on. This put John in a fairly unwinnable position. He didn't have the threat range to threaten Manny's base of objectives, but was otherwise unable to score highly for himself. Now that said, on turn 2, there was a pretty interesting interaction. Manny attempted to charge into some scouts with a legionary unit that would have allowed for a potentially disastrous heroic intervention, which could have given John an out to win.
So the unit of scouts just exists right there, but then directly behind them. So a heroic intervention would almost certainly get into that unit.
And that is what Manny has realized, by the way. He's realizing that it's possible for the other squad to heroically intervene and use it to get into the objective the Rhino is sitting on.
Manny wasn't aware of the heroic intervention being in range at the time, and after a discussion with the players, John ultimately allowed Manny a take back on the charge.
Yeah, so the back and forth there is what's happened. So John explained the interaction of heroic intervention and what could possibly happen if that was successfully made the charge to Manny after Manny had already declared the charge. Manny then decided he was going to go through with the charge, but also try to reroll to fail it. He didn't. He actually made the charge twice in a row, and then they were doing some measurements about if they could figure out how to move around the legionaries. John then came across the side of the table, had a chat with Manny, and said, look, since we didn't talk about the interaction beforehand, I'm going to let you take the charge back.
Take the charge back. Pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
I may be like, you spent the CP, but take the charge back. That is the cost.
I don't even think that happened, but
I don't think it happened either. I think John was completely
I think incredible
totally
sportsmanship there from John.
Yes.
An absolutely staggering display of sportsmanship on what is one of the most high-pressure, high-stress games of Warhammer 40k of the year. This allowed Manny to cement his position with his units blocking out where a lot of John's units could potentially move to, and while John was able to push forward and make some points in the late game, it ultimately wasn't enough for him to be able to beat Manny's score lead, and eventually the game was called in Manny's favor. And that made Manny Chima the first world champion of Warhammer 40k playing Chaos Space Marines. He took an interesting archetype of an incredibly strong army, played it absolutely spectacularly against some of the best players in the world, running the best list archetypes in the world, and absolutely deserves the win. Huge congratulations to Manny for taking the event down. An absolutely staggering show of Warhammer 40k skill, and all of the games of the event were incredibly fun to watch. Moving on to the future with a data slate update rearing its ugly head within the next 1 to 2 months, as well as a new codex for Chaos Space Marines, it'll be interesting to see if Chaos Space Marines remain at as powerful of a level as they are right now. But until then, I'd expect to see a lot of them on the tabletops of Warhammer 40k. Obviously, that said, they can be beaten, and John Lennon's Ultramarines were almost able to act as the foil to them twice over the course of the event. Things came incredibly close to Manny Chima losing the championship crown, but he was able to pull it out and win over 10 games of 40k. So let me know down in the comment section what you think of the World Championship format, its coverage, and Manny Chima's winning list. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Everwinter for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of the commentators and streams that gave coverage of the event over the weekend for us to watch from the safety of our comfy homes. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to be classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. And was streamed on the French Wargame Twitch channel. I know, Inky. Very exciting. French Wargame, huh? Very cute. You're so cute. I love you.